In this video, we'll talk about intertemporal choice, which concern choices that offer different options that play out in the future. So the consequences occur only in the future. This is an example of complex choice. We'll first go over a number of behavioral models that the field has identified or that have influenced the field. And then we'll go over 3 different neural models of intertemporal choice, all suggesting that intertemporal choice may be processed by somewhat different brain systems. So let's talk about the experiments that are commonly conducted to study intertemporal choice. And what's typically done is we give our participants a decision between some smaller but sooner outcome and a later but larger outcome. So in this case, in the orange case, that's the option of $20 that could be received right now, or $20 that could be received in a month from now, or $24, sorry, that could be received in a month from now. So we have a larger outcome, but we have a delay that's attached to this. And the decision maker might choose to go for the $20 right now because there is some value attached to receiving something immediately. But a more patient person might choose to wait a month to get the additional $4. A similar choice could be made that with more delayed options. So this is 3 years from now, where we offer $20 in 3 years and $24 in 3 years and 1 month. You can see the delay is exactly the same, but this is both delayed by 3 years. And here, most decision makers will probably go and wait 1 more month, since they have to wait anyway 3 years already to get the additional $4, because since we have to wait so long anyway, the additional month does not seem to make a difference. Notice that in these trials, we have a now option, which is the immediate reward. And in some models that we'll discuss in a second, this is more heavily discounted. So the now option actually seems to trigger a special response, seems to be more valued than any kind of delay that occurs. So let's see how this was modeled in, decision theory, if you will. So the first model that was suggested to describe these types of behaviors is exponential discounted utility. And what we have here is we have this delta parameter, which is the discounting parameter that determines the slope of the discounting function. Now you can see this nicely here. This is a delta parameter that's close to 1. It's close to linearity, obviously. This is, after all, a power function. And as the delta parameter decreases or becomes closer to 0, there's a steeper discounting function here. So this basically means that there's a discount applied that is a fixed percentage at every time step. And this would be a basically rational discounted utility. This obviously rests on 2 assumptions. The first assumption is transitivity or ordering, and the second assumption is stationarity. Transitivity basically just means that if you choose $10 today over $11 in a week, you should also choose $11 in a week over $12 in 2 weeks. So basically stating that the ordering shouldn't change as different choice options are offered to you. Because obviously we have a fixed percentage that's applied to this. The second assumption is the stationarity assumption, which means that if the decision maker moves in time, the preferences don't change, right? We'll go into this in just a second, but this basically contradicts the typical behaviors of dieters or addicts who commonly fall off the wagon. So they make a plan right now when they're kind of satiated. They just ate, and then they say, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to eat less, or tomorrow I'm not going to shoot up, or whatever drug of preference they take. But then as tomorrow comes, their behavior changes quite drastically and they fall off the wagon. So let's consider the stationarity assumption in somewhat more detail. And let's see if we can identify the assumption here based on the figures here. So we have 2 time points here, the subjective values plotted on the y-axis, and these are 2 different choice options. that have a subjective value, right? And we move through time. So we move now the decision maker through time. At time point 1, the decision is about these two values, a larger one and a smaller one, that have an objective value. Let's say this is $24. Let's say this is $20. Let's say this occurs now in 3 years, and this occurs in somewhat later time point, 3 years and a month. Obviously, that's not on the time scale here, but let's say so. So at time point 1, the decision maker would then say, well, obviously the top line has a higher subjective value, so I go for that line. It's the $24 in 3 years and a month. Whereas if we just wait 3 years for $20, that has a lower subjective value. If we move through time now, we waited 3 years, and this is now basically the immediate outcome, and this is the delayed outcome by a month. Then we have a choice between $20 now versus $24 in a month from now, let's say. And then exponential discounting predicts that there is no flipping here, and that we would still choose the item with the highest subjective value, which is the one that has the large objective value, so the $24 over the $20 now. Now, this is not quite what has been observed in many animal but also human experiments. In fact, what happens there often is that as the decision maker moves through time and the time points change, then the immediate outcome, or the outcome that's very close in time relative to the one that's delayed, actually gains much higher subjective value. So again, here we have the choice that a decision maker is making over an outcome that's delayed, $24 in 3 years and a month versus $20 in 3 years. And then obviously the decision maker here would say, well, the $24 is worth more, and it's worth it to wait just 1 month for an additional $4. However, when we move closer to the outcomes, so we're now at $20 immediately versus $24 in a month, there may be flipping in the subjective value such that the subjective value of the immediate outcome now is higher, which is indicated here. So the red line now overtook the blue line in subjective value, and at this 10.2, we would therefore go for the immediate outcome and not the delayed outcome, because it's not worth it for us to wait the extra delay for this outcome. So this is actually the case. Most behavioral evidence is consistent with this type of hyperbolic discounting that allows for flipping of preferences as the decision maker moves in time. And basically what this means is that we have a violation of the stationarity assumption that makes exponential discounting not a good model of most animal and human behavior. So let's have a quick look at these two types of models. We have quasi-hyperbolic discounted utility, but also hyperbolic discounted utility. In hyperbolic discounted utility, we basically measure the discount factor via this parameter k here, which is in the denominator of this equation here. So subjective value here is computed as via this equation here, and as you can see that as the k value increases, we actually have steeper discounting, specifically at the beginning for shorter delays. There's also quasi-hyperbolic discounting, which models two different discounting factors, one discounting factor in the early for short delays, and a second discounting factor for longer term delays. So we have a beta and a delta in this instantiation of quasi-hyperbolic discounting models. And you can see here that the beta is larger for the dotted line, and therefore it has a much higher initial discount value, whereas the delta is actually smaller for the dotted line, which leads to an asymptote for later or longer delays in a sense. Both of these approaches allow for time-dependent preference reversals, or basically enable these non-stationarities, which are violated in exponential discounted utility functions. One of the first studies that looked into the neural correlates of intertemporal decision making was a study by McClure et al. That was published in Science in 2004. And they based their experimental design on this quasi-hyperbolic model, So they basically assumed that there were two systems in the brain. One system that represented these immediate rewards, these immediate outcomes, so for short delays, or even more immediate for now trials, so trials that involved an immediate outcome. And then they assumed that there are regions that also show activity when delayed outcomes are involved. And in their experiment, they modeled this, so they had trials that involved immediate outcomes that they called now trials. These were options that offered a delay of 0, basically. So immediately after the experiments, participants would get the amount of money. Obviously, these involve also a smaller amount of money than those that involved some delay that is greater than 0. So choices were still between sooner, smaller outcomes and larger, later outcomes, or later, larger outcomes. Now, what they found is that there are indeed regions that are selective for immediate outcomes, and they called these beta areas based on this beta value here that determines the steepness of the immediate slope. These regions are in medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and ventral striatum. Now, we've encountered these regions before as parts of the evaluation system. So these are regions within the brain's reward system, if you will. And the responses that these regions showed is that they basically, in a sense, scale with delay magnitude, but they mostly encode when, or they mostly showed the largest the activity on those trials in which an immediate outcome was offered to the participants. And you can see this in the red line here. The red line shows the highest response or the highest level of activity across all of these regions, particularly in the ventral striatum, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate cortex. At the same time, they also found a set of regions that were non-selective. So they basically activated during the decision period independent of the delay. So you can see that all the delays overlap here. So the activation to different delays did not affect these regions, but they were nonetheless involved in the decision period. So they showed choice-related activity, and they called these delta areas that are non-selective and therefore relate to decisions that may be more delayed in time. The regions that were involved are also interesting. They involve the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which are both regions that we have encountered before, namely as regions that encode cognitive control. So having found these cognitive control regions, it's easy to make the conclusion that obviously this must involve some kind of inhibitory process that allows participants then to override maybe the impulses of the beta areas that seem to be selective for immediate outcomes, and therefore be able to choose a somewhat delayed outcome. But I have to note here that this may be a reverse inference at this point. An additional finding is also that there's greater activity in delta areas than beta areas when people are choosing later and larger rewards. So this is an indication for the hypothesis that I voiced earlier, namely that delta areas are involved in choosing the delayed rewards, whereas beta areas would be then suppressed if we choose the later but larger outcome. There's no difference between these two regions when participants chose earlier outcomes, so immediate outcomes. But there's a trend, obviously, suggesting that beta areas may be more activated there. So beta areas, remember, are ventral striatum, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, so areas that are part of the evaluation system, and delta areas are areas of dorsal and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and others. But this is clearly suggestive that maybe delta areas are involved in delayed choosing later, larger outcomes, whereas beta areas are involved in choosing sooner but smaller outcomes. So the results quite nicely fit one model of intertemporal choice, namely quasi-hyperbolic discounted utility, with two basically networks. One network called the beta regions involved in immediate rewards, which are also overlapping with valuation regions, and a second network, the delta regions, involved in delayed rewards, which may be more difficult and therefore require input of prefrontal and cognitive control areas. So in terms of cognitive neuroscience, this is actually quite an intuitive finding. But this suggests a conflict between beta and delta regions, and it's not clear from these findings how this conflict is resolved or how the input from beta and delta regions is integrated before the decision is made. A follow-up study was then conducted a few years later by Kable and Glimcher in 2007, and their approach differed a little bit. So what they did is in the scanner they offer participants these choice options, but they only showed the delayed option, so $40 in 30 days versus $20 now. So there was always an immediate option, and that was known to the subjects. So when they saw this choice option, they knew to compare it to $20 to now. And they would then vary the number of delays, which would go up to, I believe, 160, 180 days, and they would vary the amounts that were offered on each trial. Now, one interesting approach that they used is actually that's quite similar to monkey studies. So they used a very small n, but a large number of sessions and trials, which gave them a lot of power per subject to actually estimate individual choice functions. So each subject in this experiment went through 3 behavioral and 2 imaging sessions, and you can see here the timing of the experiment that was shown to them inside the scanner. So they were given this choice option, then there was some delay in between, and then they would find out. Then they would be asked to either accept or not accept the offered delay. And not accepting means they actually prefer the sooner, smaller reward or outcome. So let's look at the behavioral results from this study. And you can see here that a lot of data was collected for each participant, which allowed the participants to, the experimenters, to construct these different discount functions for each participant. This is a very patient participant in row 1, or column 1, I apologize, and this is a very impatient participant in column 3, with the middle column showing an intermediate or relatively normal discounting factor here. The first row shows the logistic choice function or sigmoid functions for each of the delay amounts or the delays across the different amounts that the subjects then selected. And you can see the fraction of delayed choices that was made on the y-axis. So this participants made a lot of delayed choices. However, in this case, some of the delayed choices even, so when it comes to 90 days or 180 days, this participant did not choose any delayed choices, did not make any delayed choices. So this participant clearly preferred immediate outcomes over delayed outcomes. This can then be translated, so these choices can then be used to compute indifference amounts for each of the different delays. So the indifference amount for 180 days for this person who's very patient was $22. For an intermediate person, the indifference amount at 180 days was close to $50, and this one didn't even have a sort of amount for an indifference amount for 120 or 180 days. And even for small delays, the indifference amount was already at $100. So this person is extremely impatient, and you had to basically pay him a lot to wait. This then also translates into this discounting function. So you can see the K factor here, which describes the steepness of this function. It's not very steep for a very patient person, and it's extremely steep for a very impatient person like participant CH here. You can then use the behavioral data to construct a model of discounted utility for each participant, which in turn can be used to compute a subjective value parameter for each trial. And this can be correlated, or this can be entered into the fMRI model to probe for basically parametric modulation with subjective value on each trial. And what the authors find here is that there's activity in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, as well as ventral striatum, that tracks the subjective value on each trial. And the subjective value here is based on the discounting models that are computed from the behavioral data. So there's basically VMPFC and ventral striatum, and these results are involved in delayed and immediate choices. So it doesn't matter whether there's a sooner smaller reward. If you compute subjective value, then these regions actually track the subjective value across all trials, those that have immediate outcomes or immediate choices and those that have delayed choices. The authors also performed a number of control analyses showing that the subjective value model does better than a model that only accounts for the amount, so the objective amount offered on each trial, the choice that participants made, the delay offered on each trial, or a fixed discount rate that is not a hyperbolic discount rate. So the model basically does better than all of these. So it seems to be subjective value coding, at least these results suggest, subjective value coding, not beta delta distinctions, is what drives these the activity in these regions. A nice thing about this study is that you can actually look at the individual subject data to see whether multiple systems are needed across participants. So there might be participants that do this task differently than others. These individual differences always exist. People have different strategies, for instance. But it turns out that different discounting functions, for instance, here the relatively patient person and here this very impatient person, are all represented in about the same regions within the brain with some anatomical variability. But I would say you can always see some region in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, although the distribution or the exact location of this region changes. You can always see the ventral striatum being activated and basically tracking these subjective discounting or models. And you can always see posterior cingulate cortex being activated across all different types of subjects. A very interesting feature about this study is that the authors then went a step further and also looked at the neurometric discounting function, if you will. So what they did is they extracted signal from all of the regions that were activated, including ventral striatum, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and then they looked at the activation as a function of delay in these regions. So you can see that for different delays, there are different activation magnitudes in these regions. And they did this across all different subjects, which allowed them basically to plot the average activation in this period, in this gray period here, and then plot a sort of neurometric discounting function based on the activation within the regions that track the subjective value. And you can see that there's a relatively patient discounting function here based on the neural data alone. So this is the normalized MR signal here, the average normalized MR signal, and then a discounting function plotted to the normalized MR signal over the different delays, right? And that it gets steeper for a somewhat impatient participant here. So the predicted MR signal is simply a scaled and shifted version of the behavioral discounting function. There seems to be a close match to the behavioral discounting function. And that's exactly what they're showing here. So here you see the neurometric fit, so the neural discounting function, and the psychometric fit. So this is a discounting function based on the neural data. This is a discounting function based on the behavioral data here in red. You can see that the lines overlap quite nicely. This is just a qualitative overlap or observation, but it's quite impressive that this can be done at the single subject level here, showing similar discounting functions across subjects.